Buffalo Trace has perfectly established itself at the pinnacle of the allocated bourbon market. But how is it that one brand was able to produce so many highly sought after bottles? How is it that one brand was able to so perfectly place itself in this complicated secondary market? Today, we're going to explore the history of the Buffalo Trace Distillery from its founding in 1775 to its modern day in 2025, its 250-year history, and discuss just exactly what's happened and how it got to the place it is today. So while the name Buffalo Trace Distillery is a modern invention, it traces its origin all the way back to 1775 with the founding of a distillery by Hancock Lee. Now, this is the same Hancock that's the namesake of Hancock's Reserve today, but that distillery didn't actually produce bourbon for about 40 years. And while we don't know much about it in the 1780s and 90s and early 1800s, we do know that in 1812, a famous Benjamin Harrison Blanton started pioneering the distillation of bourbon. And throughout the course of the next 60 years, that bourbon distillery was like any other. It didn't produce bourbon in any particularly great quantities, but it did produce bourbon, and it did it for a while, constantly refining its techniques, constantly trying to modernize itself, constantly trying to find the best methods to produce the best bourbon. But it wasn't until 1870, when Colonel E.H. Taylor took over the Buffalo Trace Distillery, that it finally started getting into the national forefront. He introduced several revolutionary techniques to the distillery, such as steam heating and climate-controlled aging in the warehouses. He ultimately renamed it to the Old-Fashioned Copper Distillery, the namesake of the modern-day OFC 1994, 5, 2002, 2003, 2005, and other vintages that we see today. This is when the history starts to pick up. So while we don't have that much information about those first 100 years between 1775 and 1870, after 1870, we have quite a lot more. In 1878, the distillery would change hands once again when the famous George T. Stagg, namesake of course, George T. Stagg, bought the distillery, keeping Colonel E.H. Taylor at its forefront, heading its operations. Though in 1882, the first major hurdle would be faced when there was a great fire. Now, we don't know the exact quantity of this fire. We don't know its size or its scope. We don't have nearly as much documentation like we do, say, of the fire that happened a century later in Kentucky, in Heaven Hill, in Bardstown. But we do know that there was a fire, and it certainly took a great amount of labor to fix. Then, a few years later, in 1897, a young 16-year-old boy named Albert B. Blanton decided to join the forces. In 1904, the distillery renames itself to the George T. Stagg Distillery. And while things begin to look really good in the early 20th century, the passing of the Bottled and Bond Act in 1897, people really starting to pick up bourbon, trusting its sources, trusting the George T. Stagg Distillery to produce true, amazing American bourbon whiskey. Then came the Volstead Act of 1919, also known as Prohibition. So in 1920, when Prohibition finally came into effect, many people were distraught. Distilleries across the country were forced to close, and only a select few were allowed to continue to produce whiskey, medicinal whiskey, in pint sizes, and George T. Stagg was one of them. So George T. Stagg was able to keep its doors open, producing very little of the bourbon that they once produced, but still able to make some money and still able to stay afloat. By the time Prohibition was repealed in 1933, it was one of just 4 distilleries in America that was able to continue to keep its doors open. And so it really had a head start in those early mid-1930s. So it had a leg up when other distilleries like Heaven Hill and Stitzel-Weller were first founded in 1935. It had already been around for 160 years, already at the forefront of the bourbon market, already knowing exactly what it's doing, and it used it to its advantage. Unfortunately though, in 1937, its first flood came about. So while we know about the flood today in 2025, and we've seen photos of Buffalo Trace in water, this was not the first time it actually happened. In 1937, there was a flood that reached 17 feet, where the famous Warehouse H, where all of Blanton's is now created, that was entirely submerged underwater. Now, ultimately, the George T. Stagg Distillery was able to bounce back. And while the 1940s were certainly slow with World War II, by the 50s, it was thriving. It was one of the most prominent distilleries in America, but its good days wouldn't last for very long. In the 1960s, generations started to shift. Americans decided that they no longer liked bourbon nearly as much. They thought that it was just a spirit for their grandfathers. And so a lot of Americans started stepping back away from bourbon, looking towards more modern spirits like gin and vodka. So in 1976, when vodka officially overtook bourbon as the most prominent spirit in America, the bourbon distilleries were in wreck. And this is the first time when we could really find out how Buffalo Trace got ahead. So the 1970s were complicated. The bourbon market had totally and completely crashed, and it's said that between 1970 and 1990, bourbon lost 50% of its market share. And so these distilleries had to find ways to get people to start drinking bourbon again. And in order to make that bourbon great again, they came up with a brilliant idea. What if we aged bourbon longer? What if we made it higher quality? What if we tried to produce the best whiskey possible so that when people tried it, they knew they had to have another bottle, they knew they had to come back to the world of bourbon, and that is exactly what they did. And in 1984, the Buffalo Trace Distillery released the first ever single barrel on the market, Blanton's Single Barrel. Now, this must have been distilled sometime in the mid-1970s. It's a bit unclear. Today, we know Blanton's to be between a 6 and 8 year bourbon, but back then, it was likely a good bit older, and it's likely that this distillation began in the early or mid-1970s. So in 1984, when they released Blanton's, it took the world by storm, and many people immediately became fans. But it wasn't done just yet. Over the next 6 years, it released both Elmer T. Lee and Rock Hill Farms, 3 single-barrel products all under the same mash bill, but picked out for the different flavor profiles as well as differing proofs, with Elmer T. Lee at 90 proof, Blanton's at 93 proof, and then Rock Hill Farms at 100 proof. And these 3 whiskeys, while pretty popular at the time, were still not anywhere close to enough to really bring the distillery back. And so the invention of more was necessary. In the 1990s, the distillery became what we know it as today. In 1992, Sazerac Company bought the George Cisac Distillery, and in 1999, they renamed it to the Buffalo Trace Distillery. But it was in the same year that it made an incredibly wise decision. That when Stitzel Weller, remember, first founded in 1935, eventually was forced to go out of business in 1992, ultimately owned many of the most popular namesake bourbons. It owned the Weller lineup. It owned the Van Winkle lineup. Ultimately, Buffalo Trace ended up buying the William Lou Weller lineup, creating what is now known as the William Lou Weller and ultimately many of the Weller products we know today. It also in 2002 partnered with the older Van Winkle distillery, which had a partnership already with Stitzel Weller to create things like Pappy Van Winkle 15-year. But now those things can be produced and released under Buffalo Trace. But we have to take a step back here and look a little bit closer into the 1970s and find out exactly what happened and why the Buffalo Trace was able to take such immense advantage of the bourbon market as we know it. So the first ever Old Van Winkle was released in 1983. That was a 10-year, first distilled in 1973. Then in 1989, the first 15-year was released, that being first distilled in 1974. And then the 20-year, the first ever Pappy Van Winkle, moving away from this squat bottle shape to the tall Pappy Van Winkle shape that we know today, that was first released as a 20-year in 1994. These were all first distilled in between 1973 and 1975 by none other than Van Winkle. So when Van Winkle started experimenting with bourbon, as his story goes, which is a story that can be told over hundreds of pages in a book that I would highly recommend many of you read, we see that his general thesis was he was going to produce the best whiskey possible. That he basically said, in looking at vodka really starting to take over the country, he knew that he needed to make the best bourbon possible in order to truly rise in fame, to truly make his family rich, to truly be able to take back the bourbon market. And he started earlier than almost anyone else. And while we see today all these 15, 20, 25-year spirits, many of them weren't released until very recently, but he started in those early 1970s, and that's why he was ahead. So by the time we got to the 1990s, he was one of the only people releasing those older products. And while most people didn't really have an appetite for whiskey that was $80, $100, $120 at the time, far beyond pretty much anything else on the market, even though it was older, even though it was better, He knew that if he just kept pushing, if he just kept working on his craft, he ultimately would be able to become successful. And of course, the rest is history. As we know, Pappy Van Winkle ultimately worked out incredibly well. But it was the Buffalo Trace Distillery wise in 2002 to work with the older Van Winkle distillery, now that they could no longer source from Stitzelweller, now that they knew that they had to actually find another place that can truly do justice to their bourbon. Well, of course, they looked to a distillery that was already well established, a distillery that had existed before the Prohibition, in fact, all the way since 1775, and they made that relationship with the then Buffalo Trace Distillery, and that is how we have the Pappy Van Winkle lineup of today. But of course, there are a lot of other products in the lineup, so let's break down exactly how a lot of them began. Well, Eagle Rare started in 1975, and it was started by Seagram's, also known now as MGP. Now, that product was ultimately bought in 1989 by Buffalo Trace, and what a genius decision that was to buy it, because once they were able to produce it themselves, it of course became one of the most popular spirits in America. At the time, it was in both 90 and 101 proof variants, but ultimately they repealed the 101 proof variant, bringing that back only a few years ago with Eagle Rare 17. And a fun fact about Eagle Rare is that it was part of the first ever Buffalo Trace Antique Collection. So that antique collection, including these three bottles here of William Lou Weller, George T. Stagg, and Thomas H. Handy, as well as Eagle Rare 17 and Sazerac 18. Well, these first bottles released in 2000, being the William Lou Weller, the Eagle Rare 17, and the Sazerac 18, well, those were first distilled in the early 1980s, because the 17-year Eagle Rare 17 must have been distilled in 1983. But they only bought the brand in 1989, meaning that those barrels that had been laid down, it's unclear what they were actually supposed to be laid down for. Because of course, they could not have planned that they were going to put that in an antique collection back then, but they just laid down barrels. Because this was Buffalo Trace, they were smart. They knew, as the bourbon market was crashing, that they needed to be at the front of producing the best whiskey possible. And so they laid down hundreds, yea, thousands of barrels in these years. And ultimately, some of those were able to go on to become Eagle Rare 17 in 2000. They went on to become William Lou Weller, named after a famous distiller in the mid-19th century that really started first experimenting with weeded bourbons, and now has an absolutely gorgeous bottle named after him. That was first distilled in 1981 and released in 2000. Now, that William Lou Weller released only for about 3 years, and at that point was 19 years old and 90 proof. But in 2002, it stopped, and we didn't see any William Lou Weller in 2003 or 2004. And then in 2005, we saw it as it is today, a cask strength 12-year expression. So very different from what it once was, and one can only imagine what those 19-year, 90 proof whiskeys were actually like. Of course, first distilled in the early 1980s. And then there's Thomas H. Handy, named after the man that reinvented the Sazerac in the mid-19th century, replacing the French brandy base with rye whiskey, making the Sazerac what it is today in America as one of the most famous cocktails, and therefore earning himself the namesake of Thomas H. Handy. So we've gone over Thomas H. Handy, George T. Stagg, William Lou Weller, Eagle Rare 17, and Sazerac 18, of course, just named after the Sazerac brand. So that is the Buffalo Trace Antique Collection. Of course, we know that E.H. Taylor was named after the man in 1870 that bought the distillery. We know that Weller was named after the great weeded bourbon connoisseur of the mid-19th century, and of course, the name originating with Stitzelweller and only bought up by Buffalo Trace in the early 2000s. But we have these old bottles and these newer bottles. And then as we look to the more modern-day Buffalo Trace, we have many more inventions that we see today and we may not realize are actually all that new. To begin, Stagg Jr., invented in 2013. Before this, there weren't really all that many cask strength offerings. Beyond just George T. Stagg, first released in 2002, and William Lou Weller becoming cask strength in 2005, there were virtually no cask strength offerings on the market outside of the Wild Turkey Rare Breed and Booker's. And so Stagg Jr. really took the market by storm by releasing in 2013 and of course becoming what it is today. The Weller lineup also was really invented in the last few years. Well, we did have what is known as the Ancient Weller, this being a 1994 offering, but these going back as early as the 1930s. Well, it wasn't until 2018 that we had Weller CYPB, it wasn't until 2019 that we had Weller Full Proof, and it wasn't until 2020 that we had Weller Single Barrel. So the lineup that we know today of 6 different Rainbow Wellers, 3 of them were released in the last 7 years. Those other 3 though, well, It's unclear when Special Release actually released, but there are reports of it existing since really around the 1930s. And we know that the 7-year 107 was also likely around the 1930s, and then the 12-year probably started around 2000. And so if we look at all the dates here, we can see that there's a wide range of products, and that Buffalo Trace and its magic comes not only from being really quick and on top of creating that bourbon in the 1970s and 80s so that they can release it throughout the 90s, 2000s, be at the top, already having decades of experience. It also came from their partnerships. It also came from them knowing and seeing that the Van Winkle lineup was worth working with. That Stitzel-Weller was a magical place that people today are still sad about the fact that it ever closed down, but it was Buffalo Trace that ended up capitalizing on that opportunity. And so when we look back on this brief history of Buffalo Trace Distillery, we see a few common themes. We see hardship. A fire in 1882, a flood in 1937. We see Prohibition essentially killing its market in the 1920s, but we see it constantly bouncing back, constantly being better than before. We see it knowing its partnerships, knowing its relationships, working with George T. Stagg, able to bring it certain funds that just put it ahead in the late 19th century. We see its ultimate relationship with Stitzel-Weller and Van Winkle, producing its greatness that it is today. And we see a product lineup that ranges from some of the best whiskeys in America to having a shelfer for everybody. The classic Buffalo Trace, a bottle that I don't even own, was released right around when Buffalo Trace Distillery was first named Buffalo Trace in 1999, and that bottle able to get in the hands of millions of Americans and bringing them into the world of bourbon that we know it today. Buffalo Trace is my favorite distillery, and as I've continued to look into its history of every single bottle, I know that each one can tell a complex story. And while this was designed as more of a brief history to give a little bit of an overview and experiment with a topic idea that I'm very interested in, telling the history of all these different bourbons, I ask you all then a question. If you guys want to see a more comprehensive history, telling more particular stories of each one of these products, if you guys want to see a history of Heaven Hill, a history of Jim Beam, a history of all these other great distilleries in Kentucky and the like, let me know down below in the comments. Like this video, subscribe, and let me know if this is more of the kind of content you guys want to see, or if we should get back to actually drinking our whiskey, not just talking about it. But with that, I hope you all have a lovely rest of your day. I hope you all learned at least something new about the Buffalo Trace Distillery today. And with that, I'll see you all in the next one.